Okay, so the human abstract. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor, and mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we. And mutual fear brings peace till the selfish loves increase. Then cruelty knits a snare, and spreads his baits with care. He sits down with his holy fears, and waters the ground with tears. Then humility takes its root underneath his foot. Soon spreads the dismal shade of mystery over his head, and the caterpillar and fly feed on the mystery. And it bears the fruit of deceit, ruddy and sweet to eat, and the raven his nest has made in its thickest shade. The gods of the earth and sea thought through nature to find this tree, but their search was all in vain. There grows one in the human brain. So I think it's best to start by explaining what this poem is about. So Blake basically explains that without poverty, there would be no pity, and that if everybody was happy, there would be no mercy, and that peace only exists when there's fear, and cruelty fuels humility, mystery, and deceit. So each of those is one of the 4 virtues as expressed in the Christian religion, especially during this time period. So he is explaining basically that all of these concepts are man-made, and that without certain things which were created by man and are specific only to humankind, we wouldn't have those 4 virtues. So then if we go back to the poem, we go back and we can look at personification. So the capitalization of the 4 virtues and then some other words is basically meant so that the poem, like each of the words, is human, is to exemplify that each of these things are very human. So when it says that cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care, and then he sits down with his holy fears and waters the ground with tears, it's cruelty that is doing these things. So by doing that, Blake is basically further expressing that these concepts are specific only to man, and that they are created by man for man. So then we can move on to rhyme. So the purpose of rhyme is it can help, along with rhythm, is to help bring structure to poetry. So it creates a connection with the audience. And so if, for example, with Edgar Allan Poe, you're going to pay more attention if he uses dreary and weary in opposing lines versus dreary and tiring. So then it also allows for a sudden break later. So if he, like in the human abstract, you have your AABB rhyme scheme up until the 4th stanza, where there's a break in there, and that basically just calls attention to that part of the poem, which can be a very good tool. So then, along with rhythm comes assonance. So assonance is basically when you have rhyme using vowels. So in the poem, and mutual fear brings peace till the selfish loves increase, then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care. So this just it goes hand in hand with rhyme, and it was important to include it because the human abstract uses assonance. So then we get to archetypes. So in literature, an archetype is a typical character, an action, or a situation that seems to represent such universal patterns of human nature. So they can also be known as symbols, they could be a theme, a character, or even a setting. So in the case of the human experience, the words as mentioned above, the four virtues, and the other words that are capitalized would be examples of archetypes, because they recur in human culture because they are human culture, and they are experienced by all races and all people all across the planet, making them an archetype. So overall, if you really thought about it, the entire poem could just be one big archetype. So then, it's also important to understand with this poem the time period. So this poem is almost a sequel to another poem that Blake wrote earlier, before the Industrial Revolution, called The Divine Image. So I'll read the Divine Image to you. To mercy, pity, peace, and love all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man his child in care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace, and all must love the human form. In heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. So this poem is basically the opposite of the human abstract, although it uses the same ideas and the same four virtues. Because of the change in time period, at this point he had a very different view on the four. So in this poem, he attributes the four virtues as being godly instead of human. So he says basically that these things were bestowed upon humanity by God, and he uses them in a more positive context rather than negative. So if you look at the last stanza, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. So he's basically saying that God is making these things great, and he's making these things for humanity. And so it's how God is making humanity great, as compared to human abstract, which is saying that without these terrible things that are happening, we wouldn't have the four virtues, and these things are created by humans and are human attributes rather than things created by God. So then, to understand this context for his change, we need to look at what basically happened during the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution first occurred in Great Britain in the early 18th century, basically around the time Blake was writing poetry. And so along with the Industrial Revolution, people were moving to cities, causing overpopulation and crowding in large cities because people were looking for jobs. So this caused a quick spread of disease, and then so there was a lot of people dying due to disease. There was also the spread of alcoholism, which again, with disease, people aren't able to function, they aren't doing everything that they should be doing, it's just not a good time. So then in 1787, Blake's brother died of tuberculosis, which was 2 years before the publication of Songs of Innocence. So what happened with the Industrial Revolution was that there was a shift from religion to science. So basically with this, religion became less important and science became more important, as people were able to now grasp their minds around ideas of science such as those expressed earlier by people such as Charles Darwin. So it's kind of tying in with his push, it makes sense with his push away from religion and more towards the human experience and how humans are shaping the world, not so much God. So then along with it, it's because there's so much suffering and just terribleness going on in the world, it makes sense for Blake to focus more on how, like, things such as, like, poverty. So to give a better image of the Industrial Revolution, I pulled up a few pictures of the living conditions that occurred during the Industrial Revolution due to overpopulation in cities. So many people, way more than belong in one house, were all crammed into one house, which again would make it a lot easier for diseases to spread. And because there was not yet a huge interest in science, many vaccines were not yet created, so it was a lot harder to save people. So it decreased lifespans, just worsened living conditions. So people turned to alcohol, people became alcoholics, it was not a safe environment, especially for children, and children began to work in the labor force, which again attributed to this overpopulation because of poverty, so families had to send their children to work. Okay, so it is also important to understand that Blake didn't necessarily agree with the changes that were being made in Great Britain at the time. He was very against things such as child labor and the industrialization of Great Britain, as it changed his previous views and his ideals on what is good. So his change in poetry changed because of what was happening around him, not necessarily because his ideals changed, but what was happening around him changed. So he almost wrote the poems as a way of coping with what was happening around him so he could make it through it while still having some sanity. So by doing so, he keeps writing, but he's going to be changing what he writes about, or he's going to be he's seeing things in a new light that wasn't there before, because new things are happening in Great Britain and new things are going to change how you perceive the world. So after evaluating the first 3 stanzas of the poem, a different meaning and new almost appreciation of the poem can be understood. So things such as personification through capitalization of words, especially the 4 virtues, and rhyme, including assonance, archetypes, which the whole poem it's just filled with archetypes. Okay. So then learning the past of the poem and how it could influence Blake's views and how Blake perceives the world. It just overall can change your view of the poem, and it can lead to an increased understanding of the poem. So Caitlin will then explain the next 3 stanzas of the poem to create an even better understanding, and then together all of it will just create a whole new thing.